Hello students. In this presentation, let us take a look at the work of the major Latino writer Martin Espada. Martin Espada is one of the major Nuyorican writers. The word Nuyorican refers to the Puerto Rican community in New York. Nuyorican, as you can guess, is a portmanteau word made up of New York and Puerto Rico. And the poem prescribed for our study is the title poem from his collection, Alabanza. The poem is written against the background of the 9/11 attack, and particularly the crash of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Espada has often been recognized as the people's poet, as somebody whose poems and works in general speak for those whose voices are silenced, whose voices are rarely heard. He is a major poet and also a prose writer, as this list indicates. Apart from that, he has also been in the forefront as a lawyer, as an attorney, and somebody who's been taking up a lot of human rights issues, an activist who fights for the cause of the marginalized, particularly the migrants and people from ethnic communities from neighboring countries who have settled down in the United States and who therefore face a lot of discrimination. Espada has made his work, particularly his poems, a vehicle for his activism. He has fought for the sake of the marginalized and made use of his poems to convey the human rights of those who have been deprived of their voice in society for various reasons, particularly ethnic and racial reasons. And what is significant about his work is that it is not just for the Nuyoricans like him, the Puerto Ricans in New York, who have largely been marginalized. It's not just for them that he takes up his activism. He's also been a spokesperson for everyone who belongs to the lower strata and the lower classes of society, the revolutionaries who have fought against the system, and the community, the people who have moved into the United States from various other countries like San Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and he has also addressed the problems faced by the people in those countries wherever there was a civil war which would largely always be engineered by the United States. So he has been a true people's poet. And it's not just activism and a great deal of anger and protest that he expresses in his works. In fact, there is a very funny side to his work as well. His political humor is quite resounding and something that has made him a big hit among the performance poets in the United States. As the son of a Puerto Rican community organizer, Martin Espada was exposed to the life of political demonstrations and picketing from a very early age, and that was how he was initiated into a life of activism. He has time and again talked about his participation in picketings and the kind of the pictures that he would draw while he participated along with his father and other members of the Puerto Rican community in activities of picketing. And he was further inspired by a book of Latin American revolutionary poetry, which contained the works of Pablo Neruda, and many other Latin American writers. It was a book edited by Roberto Marquez, and this instilled in him the power of poetry. He realized also during the days of the participation in these rallies and marches and picketings, the fact that, there were hundreds who needed aid, who needed to be heard. And that was why he decided to take up the study of history. He majored in history, realizing the fact that the history of these marginalized communities really needed to be rewritten. The fact that the history books that they were taught in school were written entirely by white scholars was something that he noticed, and he has done his bit to write, particularly through his poems and his prose writings, about against that kind of mainstream history. He has also, and it was after that, after witnessing the political turmoil in many of the South American and Central American countries, some of which he observed up close, that he realized also to take up a career in the legal field so that he could give or lend his voice to the voiceless. So Puerto Rico, as you can see in this map, is an island situated very close to the United States, and it is from countries like Puerto Rico and Cuba and Mexico that you have a lot of immigrants moving into the United States of America. Many of them are brought or taken to the United States as laborers, as domestic help, as workers in laborers in factories and so on. So they make up the Puerto Ricans, like the Mexicans, this Hispanic population, or this Latino population makes up a significant section of the population of the United States. Growing up as the children of migrant laborers, needless to say, many among the Nuyorican youngsters experienced a great deal of injustice and racist discrimination, especially when they attended schools and, tried to mingle with the children of their neighbors, the white children, at the hands of the police, the landlords, and so on. So it was this pain and this exclusion and this feeling of alienation that probably drew many of them into poetry, through which they could express their angst. As one of the young poets has said, poetry was one way for them to prove that they were human too. Questions of identity were thoroughly explored in their works. So very much like Harlem, that became a neighborhood which fostered the creativity of the black population many decades back. Here was this community or this area in New York where you have these Nuyorican gathering and exchanging their tales of woe and thereby forming a formidable community. It took no time for them to create their own performance space, very much like the black theater of the black arts movement of the 1960s. You have the Nuyorican Poets Cafe coming up sometime during the 1970s, where you have, it's a space like where their poetry is performed. They, of course, needless to say, do not find it very easy to get themselves published. So their poems are mostly published orally. They perform, and there is a strong background of their Puerto Rican culture that is deeply embedded in their works, as a result of which it is something that gives itself easily to performance. Slam poets who, expressed the force of their emotions through their poems. And it was not just poetry, but you have the performance of plays and dance, that is also music and dance is an integral part of their culture, and that is really celebrated in this space that they have created for themselves. So the New York Nuyorican Poets Cafe was founded in 1973 by a poet himself, Miguel Algarin, along with um, people like and activists and poets like Miguel Pinheiro, Bimbo Rivas, and Lucky Cienfuegos. And their motto was to listen to one another, as has been very beautifully expressed by them. We must listen to one another. We must respect one another's habits, and we must share the truth and the integrity that the voice of the poet so generally provides. The names of the major Nuyorican poets are listed here, beginning with Miguel Algarin. You also have women poets like Sandra Maria Esteves. It's to the second wave of major Nuyorican poets, after the first wave of the 1970s. From the 1990s onwards, you have the second wave of major writers coming up, and Martin Espada belongs to this second wave of the major Nuyorican poets. So it is, it's a strong political kind of poetry with its base very strong in the social reality faced by the Nuyorican. They use the language of the street. It's nothing like a refined mainstream white language. It is a language of the street, and the language that can be heard among these people who are forced to live lives that are less glamorous. And they were heavily influenced, needless to say, by beat poets, by the Black Arts movement, and other oral poetry traditions from their own native country. Discrimination, segregation, alienation, and these are some of the major themes that we encounter in the poems of the Nuyorican. Martin Espada, born in 1957, as has already been introduced, has been a campaigner for human rights in his career as a lawyer and his vocation as a poet. And one thing that predominates in his work, in his literary work, is the working class experience. He both celebrates and laments the experience of the working class population of among the Nuyorican in his poems. And as has already been mentioned again, it's not with his poems do not end with the struggles of the immigrants as they try to come to terms with the United States and try to adjust to their life in the United States. He has also, the locale of his poems has also moved beyond the borders of the United States, and you have many other Latin American communities featuring there. What is of particular interest is the way he has brought in the voice of the uprisings in those various Latin American countries, the way they waged a war against their governments, the military dictatorships, and so on. So that is Martin Espada's poetry. And he's made his poems a kind of space that brings together these marginalized communities so that they could build a strong bond of communal solidarity. This kind of solidarity, this kind of feeling of being part of a community, he realized was a way for them to confront together in a better manner the social alienation and exploitation that they were pitted against, and also for them to maintain a strong political commitment against every kind of disadvantage, against all great odds stacked against them. And in his poems, even as he laments, it's not always a saga of despair. It's not always a defeatist or a negative narrative. It's not the victim narrative that you find in his poems. On the other hand, you have the celebration of their ordinary lives. And in the midst of their life of deprivation, you have these designios, what he calls the prophetic signs, the epiphanic instances in the everyday, which convey a magical sense of solidarity and bring to the forefront the meaning of life even in the midst of power. Martin Espada has quite rightly been considered as the Pablo Neruda of North America. for the kind of spirit, the revolutionary spirit that we encounter in his works. And we see the same concern with the minorities and the third world, subjects that bring to the foreground the lacunae or the deficit of the canon that is upheld in societies like that of the United States, even when it is multicultural in every other way. So there has always, or there has for quite a long time been a clamor actually for Martin Espada to be made the United States Poet Laureate, because he has contributed so much to poetry. He has captured the spirit of the American vernacular, even while he has remained totally committed to his Puerto Rican roots, even with regard to language. Like Neruda and the other Nuyorican poets, Espada shows us through his work, particularly his poetry, that literature that is committed to celebrating the exploited and the ignored or the marginalized can help us to realize the multi-dimensional interconnectedness of all human experience in space and time. So it is through the stories of these disenfranchised people that Espada succeeds in weaving for us the innermost and often hidden chapters of history. So Espada's work, it stands as at this kind of crossroads of so many fields that are not strictly literary, history, ethnicity, law, colonialism, public memory, diaspora studies, language politics. The coming together of all these is in his work is proof of how poetry can totally become more powerful, can become a political tool if these topics are handled with the kind of superior craft that you encounter in Espada's poetry. So the better its aesthetic and cognitive makeup, the greater is its potential, its social relevance, and its impact. So Martin Espada's work is proof of this work, where you have the deepest of commitment and the subtlest of style, the harshest of realities coupled with the most experimental of form, with the most aesthetic of presentation. One of Martin Espada's well-known anthologies is the 2003 volume Alabanza, New and Selected Poems, 1982 to 2002. It's a collection of poems written in the light of some significant national, political, as well as personal events, and they explore, these poems explore new directions that broaden the geopolitical horizons that you find in Espada's work. You find a juxtaposition of various scenes from different parts of the world, from Puerto Rico, from the United States, from other parts of South America, and so on, in such a way that it's like an interlocking transnational collection with the poet or the poet's persona appearing in each one, either as a character or as a narrator or as a singer or a prophetic seer. So, for grounding a kind of postmodern fluidity, you have not just the coalescing of different locales from different parts of the world here, you also have different epochs and different situations. For example, the Spanish Civil War here is, um, placed alongside the 9/11 crisis. You have scenes from Mexico, Chile, Puerto Rico, Africa, different parts of Africa. So it's a new ethnoscape that emerges in these poems, and you have the coming together of various voices, forming a kind of medley. You have an Afghan refugee, you have a Latino like Espada himself, settled in places like Manhattan, and so on. So what you have here is a very vibrant kind of mosaic, and that is what makes it a kind of a multicultural and transnational collection. The title poem in this collection, Alabanza in Praise of Local 100, is an elegy and at the same time also a celebration of the lives of 43 members of a trade union known as Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Local 100. Now, this trade union had as its members the staff of a restaurant in New York, a restaurant called Windows on the World Restaurant. And 43 employees of this restaurant, who were members of this trade union, were killed in the terrorist attack of 9/11. And Martin Espada was involved as an attorney in some of the cases that involved these people for matters regarding to compensation after their death. Alabanza is a Spanish word which means praise, and it is praise that he has for these workers who had traveled to New York from different parts of the world and worked in this place. So he invites us, or he gives us a glimpse into their life in New York, which cannot be separated from their backgrounds in South America and different parts of the world. The terrorist attack of 9/11 was one that shook the world. It was televised almost live over the whole world, and many were the eulogies that followed for the people who lost their lives. But hardly anybody spoke about the workers, the less important people who died on that day. Most of the eulogies were in honor of the people who worked in the trade center, the World Trade Center, the the officers and other, people who worked in various offices in that busy financial building. Hardly anybody took stock of the many lives that were lost in the ghettos or in the marginalized sections of the society. And that is what Martin Espada draws our attention to. So he has great praise for all those workers who lost their lives. One among them was the cook. One look at him and you know that he is an immigrant, somebody who has come from one of the neighboring countries, in all probability, a country like Puerto Rico. The way they dress up, the way they look, it gives away their nationality. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, Oe. This is the typical look. They have shaven their heads, and then you have a tattoo printed on their shoulder. A blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fiado. Fiado is a harbor in Puerto Rico and a place from where many a ship would have set sail to take people from Puerto Rico to work in different establishments in various American cities, particularly New York. So here is this blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fiado, and that harbor of Fiado has a history to it. It tells us a great deal about the immigration or the migration of people from countries like Puerto Rico to the United States. The harbor of pirates centuries ago. It was a harbor where you had a lot of piracy or sea robbery. That word piracy is very strategically used by Martin Espada. A pirate is naturally a person whom you do not have much respect for because you think of him as a thief. He is, in fact, a sea robber. And there is a general tendency to think of, these immigrants, people from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and so on, as pirates, people who have come here to rob the rich white Americans. They are treated as not so dignified. They are treated like pirates. But the whole, uh, the whole activity of piracy has behind it a lot of history. The pirates began attacking the ships that sailed in those seas, mainly because the ships were laden with wealth. And where did the wealth come from? The wealth came from the various places that the white people looted. The whites, with their uh, great advancements in science and technology and the early navigations that they undertook around the world, naturally uh, landed in different lands, and they shipped off the natural wealth from these regions: silks, spices, natural resources, wood, timber, oil, all of these. These were uh, just loaded into the ships and shipped back to the mainland, sometimes Europe, sometimes America. And it is only because these ships were laden with wealth that you have these robbers attacking the ships in order to get wealth. Wealth that actually rightfully belonged to them, probably, because it would have been from their land that the wealth had been taken away. So you cannot look at piracy, the whole enterprise activity of piracy, without um, taking stock of the looting of the countries, the colonies and the Caribbean islands, the South American regions, all of these, the wealth from these lands were plundered by the whites. And piracy is a direct result of that. So you cannot simply brush aside this Puerto Rican person's um, presence in America as that of a pirate. He has come here because, for various reasons, he was probably part of the ships, that traveled from the Caribbean islands to the mainland to the United States. Sometimes they would have been brought here as slaves. They would have been and bought and brought to the United States to work as slaves and so on. So that whole history is brought into this. So, what Espada is trying to convey is the fact that you just cannot close your eyes to the death of these laborers and treat it as insignificant. Their lives may not be as glamorous and as important as the lives of the others, the ones who worked in the various establishments in the World Trade Center, the ones who held white collar jobs, and so on. But these people have their own histories too. So you need to take stock of Fayado, that land of Puerto Rico, which has this, lighthouse. The lighthouse is being compared. It's a beautiful image of a candle glimmering white to worship the dark saint of the sea. It's almost like a candle that is held up there to worship the dark saint of the sea. This lighthouse has seen a great deal of history unfolding in front of it. Therefore, Alabanza praised the cook's yellow pirate's cap worn in the name of Roberto Clemente. Roberto Clemente is a Caribbean baseball player. He was a superstar player, and many of these Puerto Ricans, these New Yorkers, they naturally had Roberto Clemente. They worshipped Roberto Clemente. They were fans of this player, and they would often wear a baseball cap, very much like Roberto Clemente, probably with his name printed on it and so on. And this cook, his plane that flamed into the ocean, loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes. So when you see these people, the cook and others like him, you cannot, this plane that crashed into the building, killed so many of them. It also reminds us of, along with that, probably along um, with this plane that crashed into the World Trade Center, along with the death of this cook, what went down in flames would be a plane loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes. Nicaragua is again a country in the Central American region, a country that is often prone to earthquakes. And whenever you have this kind of a natural calamity, you have resources being sent to those countries. So, these people work. The cook here is just one among a large community of workers who toil day in and day out in the big cities like New York in order to send food and other essential supplies, can loads of essentials to their people in their homelands, people who are poverty stricken, who face natural calamities, and so on. So it's the hope of all those people that has more or less been shot down into the ocean. In other words, it has just nosedived into the ocean. So many of them will now be left with no more money coming in from their people working in the United States. In the next few lines, we get a closer look at the life of these workers inside the kitchen. Praise the kitchen radio. Dial clicked even before the dial on the oven, so that music in Spanish rose before bread. Before their daily routine in the kitchen begins, they make sure that they switch on the radio so that they can hear their own Spanish songs. Praise the bread, Alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. You can see the Manhattan skyline that with its huge skyscrapers, 107 flights up and so on. It is almost like seeing the Atlantis. The Atlantis is a kind of utopian land that features in Greek legends. So this is their dreamland. The Manhattan skyline that they see gives them glimpses of that ideal land that is described in the Greek legends, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world, hear the chant of nations. So it is squinting through these tiny kitchens out through the windows that they probably get glimpses of their lands and hear the chants or the anthems and the songs of their nations. And which are these nations? They have come from all around the world, from various places, largely poverty stricken places like Ecuador, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh. These are the various places from where these workers have been brought to the United States, where they come from in order to work here. The next stanza continues with other images from the lives of these people. You have the kitchen scene where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers. It's in these tiny, cramped kitchens that these people work, these laborers work with their tiny propellers. You have some kind of exhaust fan. You can just imagine that cramped, dingy space where they work and where they perform their job. Hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans. And you have can after can being used in the kitchen, and it's almost as if an altar is raised there. This is the church that they go to. This is where they, their entire weeks are spent. It's like they raise an altar of cans. Alabanza, therefore, praise the busy boy's music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub. This is their church, this is their worship, this is their music. The music, is the chime of the dishes as they slog in the kitchen and the silverware that gets cleaned in the tub. More images from the life of these workers. Praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing. The kind of camaraderie and companionship that exists among these workers. There was one who was supposed to uh, report for duty, but because he was unwell, because he could not stop coughing, his mate, did his took his turn. The dish dog working like a dog from morning till evening. This dishwasher, who just happened to be working that morning and who died only because he was there substituting for another worker who was unwell, or probably because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. And there is also the possibility that it would have been either because his co-worker was unwell, which was often the case, living in these kind of dingy surroundings, they would naturally contract all kinds of illnesses, or it could also be because he was working overtime. Sometimes they would take these extra duties just to be able to make some money and not to have fun with that money, but only because they needed the money to buy and send it to their people back home for to pile the sacks of rice and beans, the food that they had to send to their people, to their own family members who would probably be suffering in some Caribbean island, floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. Again, the Caribbean islands, and just as many of them are earthquake prone, many of them are prone to floods too. And this image of an island that is plagued by frogs, which is surrounded by water and probably which has a flooding, as a result of which you have this constant croaking of the frogs. Anyway, it is an image that conveys a sense of a not so happy place, and to that poverty-stricken place where the people are suffering because of earthquakes, because of floods and various other calamities, these people have to work slog day in and day out in order to be able to send their supplies. Therefore, praise them. Their lives are no ordinary lives. Praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone. Again, the image of a woman, who belongs to these communities. It's not as if their life is blessed with long fairy tale romances that end with a happily lived ever after kind of marriage. That is not the kind of life. Their lives have a lot of insecurity. Their lives have a lot of uncertainty, and you may have somebody coming in today only to see that person bid goodbye to you the very next day. That it is that kind of uh, uh, shifting scenes. There's no permanence, there is no stability. It is not as if they are able to build concrete lives of permanent happiness. You may have a waitress who feels sad and therefore listens to the radio in order to soothe her heart after she has been ditched or abandoned by a man. He comes today and he leaves the next day. Alabanza. Therefore, her life is also worth celebrating. So now we come to the crash, the moment of the crash. After the thunder, wilder than thunder, it was unlike anything that had ever been heard before. After the shudder, deep in the glass of the great windows, the crash and the cracking of the glass windows, and after the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs. It's a horrible image, that the radio, the sound waves are totally disturbed with the crash. It is like listening to a tree which is full of croaking frogs. After night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen. It was bright daylight, and suddenly the crash occurred, and then it was pitch dark everywhere. So night is bursting the dam of day. Day was built up quite well, but that has been simply shattered, and you have night flooding the whole place. It was all in darkness. Darkness flooded the kitchen. For a time the stoves glowed in darkness like the lighthouses in Fiado, and at that moment, in the dark, in broad daylight, when it suddenly became dark, you could see the stoves glowing in the darkness. And that moment, at that moment, when these workers met their end, they would probably have had a vision of the lighthouse back in their homes in Fayado in Puerto Rico. For a time the stars glowed in darkness like the lighthouse in Fiado, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say, even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. No, there is no way we can get to hear anything about life after death for these people. We do not know whether they encountered God, because God has no face. We do not know whether they reached close enough to God to be able to feel the bristles on God's beard. It's just an image used to convey whether these people did reach heaven, whether they did encounter or see God. We do not know, because God has no face. And therefore I say soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of the city and cities to come. So these were like, they were just thrown into the nothingness, like smoke beings flung in constellations. It's almost as if their souls reached the constellations, reached the stars. It was an earth-shattering moment, and we can only um, conclude or visualize the fact that they have joined the stars. Like smoke beings, they have been flung into the sky and joined the constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. And there they will shine like stars over the night sky of the city and cities to come, for future, for long into the future. This day will be remembered, and long into the future we need to remember everyone, including these workers across the night sky of the city and cities to come in future too, in different parts of the world. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face, even if we cannot be sure that God did save them or that there is a God. There's a whole a great deal of uncertainty. Why did these innocent poor people have to die? Is there a God who the presiding deity who protects these people? We hardly have any proof for the existence of that kind of a benevolent, kind and loving God. But even so, I say praise them, praise these people who have now reached the stars and will shine, reminding the world forevermore about that tragic day. It is in the last section of the poem that you realize this, the transnational tale that this poem unfolds. Alabanza, when the war began from Manhattan and Kabul, two constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air. We know that soon after the attack on the World Trade Center and other such spots in the United States lost no time in attacking back. They soon uh, put two and two together and concluded that Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda was behind this terrorist attack, and therefore it was a tooth for a tooth and a nail for a nail. In other words, they fought back. They um, charged, and we know that um, a great deal of the action then happened in places like Afghanistan, because that is where the Al Qaeda was supposed to have a strong base. And finally, Osama bin Laden, was shot down in a city in Afghanistan. Abbottabad is the city. So this is Kabul. So Alabanza, when the war began, soon after this, when the war began, after the 9/11 attack, when the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, two constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other. And you can imagine, these two cities, Manhattan, the city that was attacked by or by somebody on the 11th of September, and in places in Kabul where there were other attacks soon after. You can imagine the two constellations of smoke, the all those innocents who lost their lives, the cooks here, the innocent civilians in Afghanistan, all of them, their souls moving skyward like constellations of smoke, rising and drifting to each other. And it is only in this earthy world that you have these divisions that divide these people into different categories: the white Americans, the black Africans, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, and so on. And, filling each group with so much of hatred and enmity, hostility for the other. But once they are beyond death, there is nothing that stops them from being united. They just drift towards each other, and you have this heavenly symphony of all these people coming together, mingling in icy air. There is a great deal of coldness, there is a great deal of hatred, there is a great deal of hostility. The iciness is what is indicative of that hatred, the enmity between these nations and these cultures and these religions and so on. But even in that icy cold air, you have these constellations mingling, reminding us, the earthly human beings, that all these divisions that we hang on to are futile, because it is after death that you realize that we are all, after all, one and the same. Whether you are immigrants, whether you are Afro-Americans, whether you are people from any other country or any other religion, you are all, after all, human beings. They drifted towards each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance." And the person that came from there, that constellation, told the other, "Will you teach me?" Asked the other, "Will you teach me to dance?" Because we have no music here. There's probably a veiled reference to the Taliban and the austerity, the kind of austerity that was imposed by the Taliban on countries like Afghanistan, depriving the land of any kind of entertainment, any kind of music, any kind of joy, any kind of, fun, that kind of severe restrictive measures imposed by their government. So they said, we have no music here, so can you teach us to dance? And the other said, with a Spanish tongue, the people from Puerto Rico, these laborers who worked and died on that tragic day, they said, we will definitely teach you. I will teach you because music is all we have, and that is what we can give you. It's a brilliant message that is conveyed by the poem. Instead of exchanging music and dance and culture and richness and that wealth that we have acquired all along, what we end up exchanging is just hatred, enmity, hostility, and this kind of divisive thinking. If, on the other hand, like the deadly or like the constellations, the constellations that move together in unison, drift towards each other after death, if only we had that kind of broad vision, we would know that we could have created that symphony here. It is that harmonious coming together of all these races and people that Martin Espada, um, envisions here. Sadly, it is only after death that we get a vision of that kind of union, that kind of symphony, that kind of harmony. But uh, you know, um, he 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 believes that the death of these poor laborers is just one more occasion that is reminiscent or that reminds us of this beautiful message, this heavenly harmony that we human beings are really capable of, if only we could remove this cancer of divisive thinking from amongst ourselves, from our world. So this poem, which is in a way an elegy which mourns the death of these laborers, ultimately becomes a kind of celebration because these laborers now become the messengers of a new symphony. They become the harbingers of a new tomorrow. They are like prophets who foretell a bright future of harmony and togetherness, who point out the possibility of human beings being able to bring out the best from each other and create music and harmony in the world if only they could live in a transnational world of fluid boundaries, where the boundaries merge into each other, where the boundaries are erased and everyone realizes the universality of everyone else, every other faith, and every other, uh, what shall you say, every other belief. So that is what the poem conveys. So this is pretty much the kind of tone that Martin Espada adopts in most of his poems. You do not have the kind of bitterness, that victim narrative is hardly something that you would associate with the work of Martin Espada. He, he celebrates the, this idea of a grand union, this idea of a grand coming together of all the nations and all the people belonging to different faiths. It's a predominant imagery, this symphony that you would associate with many a New Yorican or Puerto Rican New Yorican poet. And he definitely is somebody who can be considered as a representative, and this poem is a typical um, poem of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. You can imagine how this would be performed. It's almost like a sermon. Praise the Lord, hallelujah, alabanza. It's a sermon that gives us a vision of a bright new tomorrow. Okay, so do read the poem yourself and try to relive the praise that each syllable in it conveys. The celebration of these people who are in no way little or who are in no way to be ignored, because they are the messengers of a bright new harmony. So in the way that Harlem became the hub of the Afro-American Renaissance, you can think of um, this area in New York, uh, where the Nuyorican poets conglomerate and celebrate their life and uh, the life of everyone around them. Okay,